Okay then, so hopefully by now you understand some of the basic concepts of Vue, and you can see how we can create a Vue component to inject dynamic data into our template, how to use methods to react to different events in a browser like click events or other mouse events, and generally just use this component to control a certain section of our web page. But that's all we're doing at the minute, just controlling a certain part of the HTML page. And that's fine if that's all you want to do, just create a one-off widget which you can drop into your website. But ultimately, I'd like to show you how to create full websites with Vue.js, whereby we can inject multiple components and have multiple different routes or pages as well, all controlled by Vue. Now, to do that, we have to set up Vue in a very different way than we have done so far. At the minute, all we do is just link to the Vue CDN in the head. But for Vue to power full web applications, we'll need a bit more setup. And for that, we're going to use the Vue CLI. And CLI just stands for Command Line Interface. Now, don't let that put you off. It's not complicated, and I'm going to show you exactly how to use it. But essentially, this is a tool that we can use to boilerplate full Vue applications, which come along with all the configuration and structure that we need to create full Vue websites or single page applications. Remember, we talked about SPAs or single page applications earlier in the course, whereby a single HTML page is sent back to the browser from the server, and then Vue takes control of the whole application from then onwards and injects whatever components make up the website into the HTML page. And that is the kind of website we'll be creating with the Vue CLI. Now, when we use the Vue CLI, it will also provide us with some other benefits as well. For example, being able to use modern JavaScript features which are not natively supported in browsers, and providing us with a live reload development server to preview our website on, so we don't need to use the live server package we've been relying on so far. And it also minimizes all of our code for when we build it for production, which results in a better performance. So in this chapter, we'll be installing the Vue CLI and using it to create more complex and fuller Vue applications, and then later we'll also introduce the idea of using multiple routes or pages as well. First up, we'll install the Vue CLI and use it to create a blank Vue project. Before we do anything else, in order to use the Vue CLI, you'll need Node.js installed on your computer. Now, you don't need to know anything about Node, we just need it installed so that we can use the Node package manager to install the Vue CLI. So to do this, head to nodejs.org and click on the download button right here to get the latest version. Once it's downloaded, click on that and go through the install wizard, and that will install it on your computer. Now, to check it's installed correctly, you'll need to use the command line. Now, you can use whatever command line tool you want. On Windows, you can use command prompt if you wish. If you're on a Mac, you can use the terminal. I'm going to be using one called Windows Terminal, which is free to download for Windows as well. Now, inside this, you need to type node space -v and then press enter. And if this gives you back a version number, it means Node is installed correctly. If not, it means it's not, and you'll have to close this down and try to reinstall it again. So now we've got Node installed, we can use the Node Package Manager, or NPM for short, which comes along with the install, to install another package, and that is the Vue CLI. And we want to install this globally on our computer so that we can use it anywhere and we can create a Vue project in any folder on our computer. So to do this, to install a package with NPM, we say npm and then install. And if we're installing something globally on our computer, which is what we're doing, we say -g, that means to install it globally, and then the name of the package. In our case, it's @vue/CLI. So this gets us the CLI from Vue. And if we press enter, it's going to install that package for us on our computer. Okay, so now that the Vue CLI is installed, we can use it in the command line to generate Vue projects. So first of all, we need to make sure we navigate to the directory on our computer that we want to make this project in. Now to do this, you can type cd to change directory to go into a folder. For example, I'm currently in the Sean folder. If I want to go into the documents folder from here, I can say cd space documents like so, and that goes into the documents folder. If I want to go back up a level, I can type cd space ... and that goes back up a level. So I'm just going to go back into the documents folder, then I'm going to cd into a tuts folder, and then this is where I'm going to create my project. So to do this with the Vue CLI now, all we need to do is say vue create and then the name of our project. I'm going to call this modal project because as we learn, we're going to be creating a web modal. So once you've done that, press enter. And by the way, the reason we can use this vue command is because we have that Vue CLI package installed on our computer now. So press enter to create this project, and it's going to ask us a few different questions. So first of all, it's going to say, do we want to use the default setup, which is Vue 2, the default setup for Vue 3, or manually select features? Now I'm going to go with manually select features, and then down here we can select which different features we want. So we want to be able to choose the Vue version, so we keep that selected. We'll keep bevel. I'm going to press the space bar on the linter to deselect that because I don't want that for this tutorial, and then I'm going to press enter. So now I want to choose a version. The version I want here is version 3, so press enter on that. And then we want to place our config for Babel in a dedicated config file, so press that. Do you want to save this preset for future projects? I'm going to press no, and it's going to generate this project for us. Okay then, so that's all created for us. Now, if we want to open this project in VS Code, first of all, I'm going to cd into the new project directory that it's created for us inside this tuts folder. So cd and then modal-project. And it says here, run npm run serve. We're not going to do that from here. I just want to open this project up, this folder that we're currently in VS Code. So if you have VS Code installed on your computer, you can just type code space and then full stop and press enter, and this opens this project directory that we're currently in VS Code for you. If you prefer, you can just go into VS Code or whatever text editor you're using and open the folder manually, but I like to do it this way because it's quicker. So press enter and it opens up VS Code inside this project directory. So in here, you're going to see a load of different files and folders, and it might seem a bit complex at first and a bit overwhelming, but it's actually quite simple when you understand what everything is for. So I'll walk you through all of these different files and folders next. So when you first create a new Vue application using the Vue CLI like we just did, it can be quite daunting because it generates all of these different files and folders for us to make up this project. And you start thinking that using the Vue CLI was a bad mistake because it just seems way too complicated. But fear not, although it can seem complicated at first and there's a lot of files, once you start working with it and making more Vue applications, it becomes a lot less scary. So I'm just going to give you a quick walkthrough of what these files are all about, but don't worry if it doesn't sink in at first. The more we use these files, the easier it will become. So first off, the node modules folder at the top. This is where any libraries or dependencies that we use for this project are stored. In our case, the Vue library and the things it depends on are all kept in here. And anytime we install another package or library for this project, it's going to be placed in here. Now, you don't need to go in here or edit anything inside here. Now, the public folder contains the index.html file, which is sent to the browser initially. Now, this is the single page that makes up a single page application. And if we take a look inside, we can see there's virtually no content in the body. We have this empty div with an ID of app. And this is ultimately where Vue will dynamically inject component templates. Okay? Now, next up is the source folder, and it's inside the source folder that we write all of our source code. All of our different components, templates, and CSS are going to live inside here. Also in this source folder, we have this main.js file, and this is the JavaScript file that kickstarts our application. And it does that by using this create app method. Now, we also saw this method in the last chapter, but when we used it, we had to say vue.createApp. We're not doing that right here. And the reason we're not doing that is because we're directly importing this function from the Vue library. So the way this works is that we're just importing the things that we need from Vue, and then we don't have to say vue dot. It's the same kind of thing, but this import is grabbing this single function now from the Vue library, and the import automatically knows to look inside the node modules for that Vue library. So it grabs it from there, and it grabs this function which we use. So we're doing the same thing, we just don't tack it onto the Vue object anymore. Now inside we're passing this app object, and this is a Vue component. Now before, we directly added in a component using an object, and we added things like data and methods into that object. Now this is a very similar kind of thing, but this time we're not directly doing it here. Instead, we're importing a component from a Vue file. Now Vue files are known as single file components in Vue, and that's generally how we create Vue components when we work with larger projects. So now we're saying that this is the root component, which is then mounted to the DOM at this location, which is the div with an ID of app. And we can take a look at that again inside index. It's right here. So this is where the root component is going to be injected. So let's just take a little look at that app.vue file. And it looks something like this. We can see three things. It's got a template, it's got a script, and inside we have an object being exported, and this is very similar to the object that we created inside create app in previous lessons. We'll see more about that later on, but also at the bottom we have a style as well. And every Vue component or Vue file is made up of these three things, but don't worry too much about all of this for now. We'll talk more about Vue components and Vue files in the next lesson, but know that this is our root component that we're registering right here, okay? Below the source folder, we've also got a few more files. First, we have a gitignore file, and that is set up for if you want to use Git and GitHub in this project. There's also a Babel config file, which is configuration for our app so that we can use certain JavaScript features. And finally, we have packages files as well. Now, you won't need to manually edit any of those. They keep track of our different packages. You will find yourself referring to this one quite frequently though, package.json, because this will contain all of our dependencies, which we'll probably talk about a bit more later on, but it also contains the scripts to serve and build our application. So we're going to use this one now, in fact, and this is used to spin up a local development server so that we can preview our Vue application in a browser. So let me do that. The first thing we need to do is open up a terminal, and to do that you can go to terminal and new terminal, and down here make sure you're in the correct directory. It should be modal project or whatever you call your project, and then let's run this script. The way we run it is by using npm. So we say npm run and then whatever the script is called. In our case it's called serve. So let's do that. npm run serve, press enter. This spins up the local development server, and when it's done it's going to give us a link right here where it says local to open this in a browser. So I'm just going to control and click to open that in a browser, and it's appeared on my other screen over here. And now we can see this is our Vue application, and this right here, this content is what we saw in the app.vue file. And all of the templates in that file is being dynamically injected into the index page, which we get back. So if we inspect this, we should see it's all inside this div with an ID of app. That's where it's being output. So remember, when this HTML page is first sent to the browser from our local development server, this HTML page is empty for a split second. It just contains this empty div with an ID of app. But then Vue takes the app component and it renders it to the DOM inside this div element with the ID of app. Now I can demo this by adding a breakpoint in the JavaScript. So let me open up the sources, and I'm going to go to JS over here, and I'm going to go to app.js, and I'm going to scroll right to the top. And I'm going to add a breakpoint, meaning that the JavaScript now is going to stop here and it's not going to run. And if I refresh the page, when we get back, you can see it's an empty screen. And if I go to elements, we can see there's no content inside the div with an ID of app. This is the blank HTML page we get back. But then if we were to run the JavaScript, then everything is going to work and it's going to inject that component. All right, so that's how it's working. Now, all of this is happening behind the scenes by Vue, and all we really need to do is focus on creating components which we then want to render to the DOM, okay? So hopefully now you've got a basic understanding of what these files are for and how Vue is injecting a component into the web page. Don't worry too much if it seems a bit complicated for now. The more we use these files as we go on, the more it will make sense. And you can always refer back to this video for reference. Next up though, we'll take a closer look at what this Vue file is and how we use it to create a Vue component. So this thing right here. So we've seen now that this main.js file is kickstarting the application, and it's taking the app component right here and it's passing it in as the root component to create app. Now we'll talk more about root components later on, but then it's mounting it to the DOM at this location. Now this right here, this is a Vue component and it's this file. So every Vue file represents a single Vue component and it has the .vue extension at the end. And by the way, to get the syntax highlighting in here so everything looks good, make sure you have that Vue package installed. I showed you that earlier. If we go to packages, I can scroll down here and see it installed. It's this one right here. So make sure you search for it up here and install it. Otherwise, this might look a bit off. Now, every Vue component can contain 3 different parts. First of all, an HTML template. We create it here now instead of in the HTML page like we did earlier. Second, we have a script where we export the component object right here. And finally, we have a style tag for any component styles, any styles you want to apply to this template. Now, the script and the styles right here, they are actually optional, but every component must at least have a template. So first of all, let's talk about that template. Before, when we used the CDN link to use Vue.js, we created the template directly inside the index.html file, inside app right here. But this time around, we don't do that. We create the template for a component inside its component file. And the reason for that is that we might have many different components with different templates, and they might not all show at the same time inside the index.html file. So we can't directly hardcode the templates in here because, like I said, they might not all show at the same time. And also, it would mean that if we have many components, this would get very messy very quick. So we split up our templates into different components for different parts of our web page, and each component has its own template at the top. Then when we render that component to the DOM, its template is injected into the DOM. Now, the root tag must always be a template tag right here. This is a Vue tag, not a regular HTML one, but inside that you can organize your template however you wish. Now, one new feature of Vue is that you can have multiple root elements inside the template right here. It used to be that you have to have one root element which surrounds everything, but now, as you can see, there's 2 root elements. We have an image and this component, which we'll talk more about later on. Now, this works fine, but it used to be that we had to do something like this, have a div tag, and then we could place all of this inside of this div, right? That was the old way of doing it, but like I said, you don't have to do that anymore, which is really nice. You can have as many root elements inside the template as you wish. So this template right here, this is what we see in the page over here. Now, it looks a lot more on the page than we see right here, but that's because this in itself is a component which is being inserted into this component. Now, we're going to talk more about multiple components later on, so what I'm going to do is just delete this template for now and create our own simple template, which is going to be an H1, and I'll just say my first Vue app, and then save it. And when I save, the development server is going to auto refresh this in the browser. So we can see that the template has been updated and now we see the new content on the page. Next up is the script tag that we see right here, and the first thing we do inside that is import this hello world component from the components folder. This was the thing that we saw inside the template earlier. Now that's coming from the components folder. We're going to talk more about multiple components later on, so I'm going to leave that for now. And in fact, we'll delete it because we don't need the hello world components inside this file anymore. Now, next we have this object right here, and we're exporting this object. Now, this object represents the root component, much like we represented the root component as an object when we used the Vue CDN in the previous chapter. It can contain things like data, methods, computed properties, etc. At the minute, this has got a name, and this is optional. You don't have to give your components a name, but in this case, we're calling it app. And then also, we have a components property, which is registering any extra components we're using inside this component. Now, again, we don't need this anymore because we're no longer using that hello world component. So I'm just going to get rid of that. Now, like I said, we can use data and methods inside this object, much like we did before. So if I want to make some data, I can just use the data function, which returns, remember, an object. And this object has a title property in our case, and that title is going to be my first Vue app, like so. And now, instead of hard coding this, we could just output the title instead. So let me do that, double curly braces, and then title. So the way we output data is exactly the same way in this template as we did previously. So let me save this and preview now of it in the browser, and we can see that is the new title right here. Awesome. So that works. So again, we'll work much more with this object as we go forward. And like I said before, it's actually optional to have this object, but most of the time when you make components, you'll find yourself needing data and methods for the component. So you probably, about 90% of the time, will use a component object. Okay, so finally we have this style tag, which is for the component styles. And you can see right here, we're styling the app div. Now that's not technically inside this component, but it doesn't matter because these styles are actually global. Even though they're inside this component file, they apply to any elements on the page. We can scope them just to this file, just to this component, but we'll see how to do that later on. So that's pretty much it. They're the three parts that make up our component. And I tell you what, actually, I'm just going to add one style down here for the H1 so you can see that this works. Let me do this, and I'll copy and paste these in so you don't have to watch me writing them out. We have a border bottom for the H1. We say display inline block and padding bottom. If I save that now, you can see now we get that border at the bottom and a bit of padding. All right. So when we render this component to the DOM, and remember, we're doing that inside the main.js file because we're saying the root component is app and we're mounting it right here. When that happens, all of this template is injected into the index file right here. And the styles right here, they are placed in the head. And we can see that if I inspect, we can go in the head and we can see some styles at some point right here. So these are the styles that we see inside the components. And you can see they're the new ones we just created, all right? Now, just very quickly, a couple more things. This assets folder, this is where we can place anything like images that we use inside components. And we saw before that we had an image up here and it was referencing this image right here. We will work with images later on throughout the course for different projects, but that's where they will go if we do use them. And secondly, again, we saw this components file. When we make multiple components, we will be placing them in there later on, but don't concern yourself too much with this for now. So there we go. That is a Vue component in a nutshell. So next, I want to quickly talk about another concept in Vue, and that is template refs. But just really quickly, before we do move on, I want to just point out one important thing to do with the course files from this point onwards in the course. If you're downloading any of the course files from this lesson onwards, there's one more step you have to take once you've opened up the project inside VS Code, and that is to install all of the project dependencies. So all of the project dependencies that live inside Node modules, they are not inside the GitHub repository files. So what you need to do is download those files, open up the project inside VS Code, and then you open up a terminal and you type npm install, and that will install all of the project dependencies listed inside the package.json file right here. And only then, once you've done that, will you be able to run the project by using this command right here, npm run serve. If you try that before doing the install, then it's not going to work. So again, make sure you run npm install once you download the course files before you try to run the project from this point onwards. Alright, so before we dive too deep into creating these larger Vue projects and multiple components, I just want to talk for a minute about something called template refs. So sometimes when you're working with Vue, you might need to have a handle on a DOM element. Now, in regular JavaScript, we would use something like the query selector to grab that element, and then we can manipulate it if we need to. We could add classes, remove classes, change its content, etc. Now, the way we do this in Vue is not by using the query selector, but instead we use template refs. Now, template refs allow us to store a reference to a DOM element inside a variable. Then when we have that reference, we can use regular JavaScript methods and properties on it to do things like change its classes, text content, its styles, etc. So how do we use these template refs? Well, let's do an example. I'm going to create an input field and I'm going to give this a ref of name. You can call it what you want, it doesn't matter. Now, if I want to get a handle of this, I can just use this ref that I gave to it. So what I'm going to do is add a button as well. And I'll say click me here, and I'll attach a click event to this button. So @click is equal to a function I'm going to call handle click. Now down here we need our methods property. Remember, this is how we add methods to a component, and I'm going to create that handle click method that we invoke when we click on this button. So inside here, all I'm going to do is try to get a handle on this input, and the way I do that is by using the ref. So I could say console.log, and I'm going to use this to refer to this component, much like we did before. If we want to use the data, we'd say this.title. When we're using refs, we say this dot, and then it's $refs. And now I can access on that refs object any ref that we name in this template. So I've got one here called name, so I'd say dot name, and that gets me a handle now on this input field. All right, if this was called boo, then this would be boo. All right, so let me just undo that and call it name again, and we're logging this to the console when we click on the button. So let's try this out. I'm going to just make this a bit bigger on the right, click the button, and we can see we log this to the console. That's the element we have a reference to now. Okay, so what can we do with this? Well, we can do normal JavaScript things with this. We can do things like add a class, remove a class. So let's try this out. I'm going to say this dot refs.name, and I'm going to say class list, which is a JavaScript property. Then I'm going to use the add method to add a class. Again, a regular JavaScript. There's nothing Vue-like about these methods. And I'm just going to say add the class of active. So now when we click on this button, we use the ref to get a reference to this element, and then we add the class of active to that element. Save it and try this out. We need to go to this element over here. Watch the class being added over here. When I click this, boom, there we go. All right, so that's how we can use refs. Let's do one more example. I'm going to say this dot $refs.name. Then I'm going to focus it. So this again is a normal JavaScript method. When we have a DOM element, which is a form field, we can use the focus method on that to focus it in the browser. So let's have a look at this. If I click it, the focus goes to this input field. So there we go, dead simple. That's how we use refs to get references to different DOM elements. Refs also have another purpose, and you'll find that later in the course when we start to work with the composition API. But for now, this is all we need to know. So far then, we've seen how to take this single root app component and render it to the DOM. So if we wanted to, we could create an entire web page template inside this root component, and we could have our component object right here control any data of functionality of the whole template, and then we'd have our styles at the bottom to style it all as well. But if you're making a whole web page template inside one single component, then that will soon get to be a very large, hard to read, gigantic mess. We might have a lot of HTML for things like a header, a menu, a sidebar, some articles, some images, and a footer. And the component object right here controlling that HTML template might get big and unreadable too, with tons of methods, data properties, etc. And the same goes for the styles at the bottom. So it's not a good idea to put everything inside one single component or one single Vue file. Instead, what we should do is split our code up into different Vue components. For example, we might have a component for the navbar and the header. We might have a sidebar component for the sidebar templates. We could have an article component for an article we show, and we might have a footer component for the footer. Now this makes each component much more readable and easier to maintain, and it also makes our project code much more modular and reusable, because you can reuse components in multiple places in your website, and we'll see how to do all of that later as well. So in our Vue app so far, we have one component, the app.vue component, and this is known as the root component. Now, every Vue app that you create will always have a root component. Now, you can call it what you want, but when you create a new Vue app using the Vue CLI, it will always be called app.vue. Now, this is the component that sits at the top of the application structure, and it's the component that's initially mounted to the DOM. Now, ultimately, all other components we make will be nested inside this root component. So, for example, we might have a header component, an article component, and a footer component. So all of these three components represent a different part of the web page, and they are all nested individually in the root component. Now, inside those components, you might also have other components nested. For example, inside the article component, you might have a content component and a comments component as well. So this is how we structure our Vue applications. Now, I also want to go over a bit of terminology. When we structure our components like this and we nest components in other components, we call these ones child components and the component that they're nested in the parent component. And that makes sense, right? Same for this up here. The app would be the parent component of these child components. And also, this whole structure of components nested in each other that together make up a web page is called a component tree. Now, you'll probably use these types of diagrams a lot when you're planning how to structure your website with something like Vue, and we'll be using them for projects in this course later on. To begin with, we'll be keeping it simple and just creating one subcomponent that we can nest inside the root component, and that is going to be for a modal. Now, first of all, we can see that when we created this starter app with the Vue CLI, it automatically generated this components folder. And inside that, we have a component called Hello World that the Vue CLI generated as well. Now, if we take a look at this, it looks very much like the app.vue folder in that it has a template, which is significantly bigger, but it also has a script with an object inside it, and we have styles at the bottom. Now, I'm actually going to delete this file because I don't need it, and instead I'm going to create a new file inside the components folder called modal with a capital M, and this is a naming convention that I like to use whenever I'm creating a new Vue component. I start it with a capital letter. You don't have to, that's just my convention, but you can call it whatever you want, but it must have the .vue extension. And by the way, we don't have to put this inside the components folder either if we don't want to. That's just another convention. But you can place it anywhere inside the source folder if you prefer. But I'm going to leave it here for now, and I will talk a little bit more about folder structure later on. So inside this component, I want to create a modal or a pop-up which we can show in the browser. Now, to do this, we're going to need a template and also some styles, but at the minute we don't technically need a script tag. We might use that later if we have some data or if we have some methods we want to use in here, but for now we don't need it. So let's first just do the template, and then inside that template will create the HTML for this modal. Now it's just going to be a div, and it's going to have a class equal to backdrop first of all, and this is going to be the backdrop behind the modal. So you know when you have a modal popped up on your screen, it fades the background out. That's what this backdrop is going to be. We're going to make this kind of like a semi-transparent dark grey or black, and that's going to go behind the modal itself. Now inside that, I'm going to create a div with a class of modal, and this is the actual modal pop-up itself that appears on top of the backdrop. And inside that modal, we need some kind of content, so we'll do a paragraph tag for that, and we'll just say modal content right here. Okay, so that's our template, dead simple. Now I'm also going to create a style tag, and this is just to style these different elements. And I'm going to paste these in because I don't want to bore you with writing out CSS, but I will go through them. So we target the modal right here first of all, and we're giving this a width of 400 pixels, a bit of padding, margin top and bottom, left and right auto, so it's centrally aligned in the middle of the page. The background of the modal is white, and it's got a border radius to soften the corners. Now the backdrop is positioned fixed, and from the top is 0 pixels, so it starts at the top and it's fixed on the page, so it's always there. The background, we use RGBA and color it black. The alpha channel right here controls the transparency, and we're saying it's 0.5, so that's semi-transparent. And then the width is 100% of the browser, and the height is 100% of the browser as well. So that is our modal component right there. Now we want to be able to use this modal component inside our app component. So how do we do this? Well, it's pretty simple. There's a couple of different steps. First, we have to import this modal component inside the script. So you know, like we saw the hello world component being imported before, we're going to do the same thing this time for the modal. So I'm going to say import and then modal from, and it's going to be ./components/modal. So this right here, you can call what you want because we don't explicitly name the export, but this right here has to be the file name. And in fact, I'm going to say .vue right here. You don't need to add .vue, but I always generally do. All right, so we're importing this right now, and now we want to use it inside this component. So we have to register that we want to use this modal component inside this component, and the way we do that is inside this object right here. So I can come down here and say components as a property, which is an object, and inside here I can say modal like that, and that's all I need to do. Whatever you call it here, we can name a property right here. So if I want to use that in the template, I can just say modal like so, like an HTML tag, but this won't work unless I first import it and then register it inside the component. All right, so there's two steps before we use it, and then we nest it as if it was just another HTML tag. So if I take a look at this, all of this template now will be placed right here inside this component, so underneath the H1. So let's save that and preview this in the browser, and we can see it right there. So now we've created this component, we can use it in whatever other component that we want to, and we could use it multiple times if we wanted to. I could do 2. I'm not going to do that because that's a bit daft, but I could do if I wanted to. So it makes all of this code really reusable. Now, just a couple of things about naming your components. If you don't start them with a capital letter, make sure that you do not name them the same as a regular HTML tag like footer or header or nav, because that will cause a conflict when you try to output them in the template, because the tag will represent both your component and a regular HTML tag that already exists. However, if they start with a capital over here, then there will be no conflict.